Anybody who has a question later on can simply use the Q&A function, which will then allow us to keep a better overview of what is in there. Wonderful.
We are live now.
Perfect. So that did work out. So as we are live, I cordially welcome everyone to the last session of day 5 of the EU-India People's Summit. And for those, I see a lot of participants that we haven't seen at previous events and cordially welcome them too. The idea of the EU-India People's Summit is to get together people not only from politics, but academia, activists, journalists, and people who have otherwise somehow been involved with social issues and other issues that the European Union and India are concerned about and have envisaged as partnership areas or strategic cooperation issues. And since the European Union and India are meeting on Saturday, on May 8th, we are putting together a people's roadmap for issues that the European Union should consider, but also our vision of how India and the European Union should go ahead as partners. And for that, we're taking a very holistic take on EU-India relations by looking at the people in each country and really delving into some contentious issues and unpacking them to understand the complexities. So on this note, I hand over to Kalpana to moderate the panel for tonight.
Thank you very much, Alina. And I'd like to thank you and everyone at the London Story for all their efforts in putting this, this series of really important sessions together. So as Alina has said, this session is about feminism and Islamophobia, India and Kashmir. And I'm Kalpana Wilson, and I'm chairing this on behalf of South Asia Solidarity Group, which is hosting this particular session. So we're really happy to have with us today two brilliant and inspiring speakers. Dr. Insha Malik, who's joining us from Afghanistan, where she's currently based as a researcher, and Kavita Krishnan, who is joining us from Delhi. And I just wanted to also mention at this point that we are really very relieved and happy that Kavita is well enough to join us this evening, as she's just recovering from COVID-19. I'm of course going to introduce our speakers a bit more fully in a moment, and I'm sure you're all really eager to listen to them. But before that, I'm just going to briefly explain a little bit of the background as to why we're having this session on this topic of feminism and Islamophobia at this particular juncture. Now, we actually formulated this a few weeks ago, out of the conviction that looking at the connections between patriarchy and Islamophobia is absolutely essential to understanding the current moment in India and Kashmir and to formulating a meaningful feminist response. So some of the questions that we wanted to think about included how patriarchy and Islamophobia intersect under what we see as India's Hindu supremacist regime. Why is resisting the kind of state-sponsored hate campaigns we've been seeing, like, for example, this myth of love jihad, why is that a feminist issue? How does Modi's brand of patriarchy fit with corporate interests, for example, around cheap labor, population control, and so on? And then questions also like, why were Muslim women at the forefront of opposing India's Islamophobic new citizenship laws? We also need to look at how notions of women's rights have been appropriated, in particular to try to justify what many have described as a new phase of settled colonialism in Kashmir. And how have Kashmiri women resisted this? What can feminist solidarity with women in Kashmir look like? And how do experiences in India and Kashmir relate to the targeting of Muslim women by states across Europe? For example, the recent developments we've seen in France, in the Netherlands, in the UK, and other countries. Once again, this targeting being legitimized by this projection of an idea that gender oppression is something which is somehow exceptionally Muslim. Now, of course, since we planned this session, we've seen the escalation of the COVID-19 second wave in India to horrific proportions. And this is something we'll inevitably be talking about too. Because as we know, the scale of the crisis was completely avoidable. And we cannot look at what's happening in isolation from the responsibility of the Modi government and all of the issues which I think are going to emerge in our discussion when we look at how Islamophobia and patriarchy operate within the ruling Hindu supremacist ideology. I think these will also help us explain how and why we got to this point with the pandemic in India. And we have to also acknowledge the conditions which make this new wave of COVID particularly terrifying in Kashmir. For example, the fact that there is only one doctor for several thousand people, but there's an Indian army soldier for every handful of people. For example, the ongoing effects of the communication siege. And of course, right now, the fact that the Amarnath Yatra, the pilgrimage, which has the potential to become another super spreader event, has not been cancelled. So we in South Asia Solidarity Group are based in the UK. And like many others who are outside, we share the feelings of helplessness and the kind of constant anxiety over loved ones who are in India and Kashmir. But what we're trying to do, again, like many others, is to support the initiatives for relief which are being taken by people on the ground. As I'm sure you'll all know, whereas the government is doing nothing and is busy trying to silence even those who dare to ask for oxygen, we're seeing tremendous efforts on the ground. And we're particularly trying to amplify those which are reaching the most marginalized, those in rural areas and smaller towns, Dalit communities, Adivasi communities, LGBTQI people, migrant workers who are again facing destitution, and many others. And alongside trying to support these, we're also urging people not to donate to Seva International, which is an arm of the RSS, who are the Hindutva fascist stormtroopers, essentially. RSS-linked organizations are especially strong in the UK, with at the moment key government ministers like Priti Patel and Rishi Sunak closely aligned with them. But what we're really saying is, please check out organizations before donating to them. Seva International is the most prominent, but there are others which are linked to the Sangh Parivar, the Hindu right-wing family of organizations. So for example, in the UK, you have the BAPS charities, which are also linked to them. And it's important not to give your money to them, not only because it will strengthen the Hindu right-wing forces, but because we know this money very often does not go to relief efforts of any kind. It gets diverted. And there are in-depth investigations already published around, for example, what happened after the 2001 Gujarat earthquake, when funds which were raised abroad by Seva International went to organizations which were directly involved in the genocidal violence of 2002. Now, in South Asia Solidarity Group, we're also campaigning at the moment around vaccines. On one level, we're part of the global campaign for a TRIPS waiver and an end to vaccine apartheid internationally. And in the context of India, we're calling very urgently for Modi to immediately reverse the kind of deadly decisions he's made. For example, that which allows corporates to fix the prices of vaccines and allows companies like the Poonawalla Serum Institute of India to make huge profits at the expense of more and more lives. So just to briefly explain how it will be organized this evening, First, we'll hear from our two speakers. And then after that, we'll have a kind of short discussion between the three of us, more of a conversation, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. So please do put your questions in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen in the middle. So I'm going to start by calling on Kavita. Just to many people, she needs no introduction, but she's a feminist and a left activist and a writer. She's the National Secretary of AQA, the All India Progressive Women's Association, which is a mass organization of rural and urban working women, as well as being a Politburo member of the Communist Party of India, Marxist-Leninist, and editor of its magazine Liberation. And Kavita has been at the forefront of a whole range of feminist struggles during the last decade and more. Many people remember her involvement in the 2012 anti-rape movement, which really changed a lot of people's thinking, both within and about that movement. And she's been central to campaigns such as the Love Azad campaign against the myth of love jihad and many other such campaigns. Kavita's book, Fearless Freedom, which explores many feminist questions, as well as taking apart the whole notion of women's safety, was published by Penguin in 2020. She has also consistently spoken out for human rights in Kashmir and was one of the first to go to Kashmir after the abrogation of Article 370 as part of a fact-finding team, and to publicize in India what was going on in that whole period of a complete communications shutdown aimed at silencing Kashmiris. So I'll hand over to you, Kavita.
Thank you, Kalpana, and thank you to the EU-India Summit as well as South Asia Solidarity Group. And I'm really happy to be able to make it here and to be able to listen to Insha as well today. So I'll get right down to it because there's quite a lot of ground to cover, and I think I'll only be able to sort of indicate some of the factors that are at play here, and then maybe through questions we can discuss some things at greater length as people wish. Kalpana mentioned the situation right now, the COVID-19 situation, which many of you will be aware of course, but I think it's difficult to describe the absolute chaos and sense of helplessness and anger here, because every day we are getting news about some friend or some relative or the other who has died because of COVID-19, because of lack of availability of oxygen, because of lack of availability of hospital beds. And I'm talking about, of course, about cities, even the city of Delhi. But even beyond Delhi and even beyond cities, I mean, the virus has now reached rural India, and the government is not interested in keeping track of who is living and who is dying. So they're actually trying to push down the numbers, and they have no interest whatsoever in trying to control this pandemic and curb this pandemic at all. So what they are interested in is in two things. One is how to manage the image of the government. And the other has always been for them, for this particular government, for the Modi government, every issue is weighed in terms of how can we spin it to further our Hindu supremacist politics. And COVID-19 was no different. So I want to point out that last year when the pandemic first hit, then one of the first things this government did, you see, during the pandemic, you were having anti-Muslim violence in Delhi, which was orchestrated by the Bharatiya Janata Party after they had lost the Delhi elections. And Donald Trump was visiting at that time. And what they did was, I mean, there were many Muslims killed at that time. And subsequently, throughout the pandemic, what they have done is that they have targetedly arrested a whole range of activists. And you will remember that activists who were involved in the movement against the Citizenship Amendment Act and the NRC. And it was women, Muslim women, who were at the forefront of that, as well as students and young people from all kinds of backgrounds. And this government has particularly gone after young feminist activists. It has arrested several of them. And it has attempted to justify this. They have arrested all the activists under draconian laws, which are basically national security laws. But they're very draconian because you can keep people in prison without bail and without trial for a very long time, for several years, if you wish, under this law. So that's what they have done. And to justify this, of course, they have tried to equate feminism, and especially feminist activism by Muslim women, with anti-India activity. So the very specter that they keep raising of the young Muslim woman as an activist is one which is supposed to rouse fear in people and so on. So they've done that. The other thing is that right when the pandemic hit, there was a Muslim gathering from all over the world that was going on in Delhi. It had received permission from the government. The government had not announced a lockdown then, had not stopped flights into Delhi. So they were perfectly justified in holding their gathering. But that gathering, the government tried to blame the entire pandemic coming into India on the Muslims. So they tried to say this is a China-made virus that is being produced by China and distributed in India by Muslims. And they did this, and it affected their entire dealing with COVID for the first several months, because in a sense, they were only trying to look at people in terms of their proximity to that gathering in Delhi, which was obviously a terrible way of looking at things, because that was not the only source of the virus. In fact, the people at that gathering were victims of the virus. They got it here. They did not bring it from outside. And of course, this was pointed out by courts subsequently. But the Islamophobia and the manner in which Islamophobia affects governance, affects even how this government looks at a pandemic, their priorities during a pandemic, it's quite telling, right? The other thing is that if you compare, that gathering in Delhi was a fairly small gathering. After all, it was a meeting and it was being held in a small hall of some kind. But in the second wave, right in the month of April, even though a second wave had been warned of, it had been warned that there may be new strains, there may be other variants that may spread much faster, that may affect people differently. The government set aside all these warnings, and they insisted on hosting and allowing a huge gathering where more than 9 million people participated throughout the month of April, called the Kumbh Mela, which is a Hindu religious gathering. It's supposed to take place every 12 years. It was supposed to take place next year, but they preponed it. They brought it ahead by 1 year to hold it right in the middle of April, right when the second wave was due. And of course, the media, which largely serves Narendra Modi, especially the electronic media, they had been at the forefront of trying to demonize the Tablighi Jamaat gathering, the Muslim gathering last year, but they were completely silent on the possibility of what the Kumbh Mela could do in terms of the virus. And this also shows you how Islamophobia in the media, which Modi controls and which serves Modi, how that affects people's understanding of what spreads the pandemic, actually, what spreads the virus. So you had this huge gathering, and you had BJP leaders telling people, look, you can't compare this with that Muslim gathering, the Tablighi Jamaat gathering, because the virus will not affect Hindus. The Hindus have the protection of these goddesses, they have the protection of the Ganga River and so on, and it can't affect Hindus and things like that. So they were actively spreading misinformation in service of their Hindu supremacist agenda. And now the result is in front of us. And the Kumbh Mela is only one of the larger gatherings. There were several other similar gatherings which are still going on. Kalpana mentioned the Amarnath Yatra, which is supposed to go to Kashmir. It has been put on hold right now because of COVID-19, but unfortunately, many of us fear that the minute they sense that there is some, maybe the people are getting some control over the virus, they're likely to open it up again. The other thing I'd like to mention is that elections were held right in the middle of this pandemic, and assembly elections were held, as well as local body elections in the state of Uttar Pradesh. 700 teachers who were on election duty died because they were sort of chain ganged into, forced into acting as, performing as election staff in the UP local body elections. It's important to know this because how does this government succeed in, what are its strategies in diverting attention away from these absolute scandals? One of their favorite ways of doing this is to, give an Islamophobic spin to everything and to divert attention by creating a noise around an imagined Hindu-Muslim conflict. In the elections, in the assembly elections, it was no different. There were many, many instances. I won't go into all of them, but just to give you a brief idea, in the West Bengal elections, for instance, which the BJP lost quite badly, the BJP's entire campaign was both misogynist and Islamophobic in the sense that it tried to imply that the Trinamool Congress is led by a woman, Mamata Banerjee, and that she is, although she bears a Hindu name, she is actually a closet Muslim, or she's, so they would use these words, which are used lovingly for Muslim women. So to imply aunt, or in your maternal or paternal aunt in Urdu. So fufu or khala. So, but they would use these names for her as a derogatory, as abusive words. And they would try to, how would they make it abusive? By saying she is the fufu or the khala of infiltrators or Rohingyas. So infiltrator is supposed to imply Muslims, all Muslims, they don't belong in India. They're infiltrators from outside, from Bangladesh. And Rohingya was used as a word of abuse. So the fact that this campaign failed is extremely, a very good thing, of course, that the BJP lost that election quite badly. But subsequently also, they are trying to give this whole spin about the verdict to imply that Muslim voters sort of did a minority veto to try and prevent Hindu opinion from prevailing in the election. And they're now trying to spin all kinds of false news about post-poll violence, trying to imply that it is violence by Muslim TMC supporters against Hindu BJP supporters. None of that is true, of course, but I won't go into details about that. I'll just briefly mention several other instances in which the BJP has tried to, another feminist act. They have tried to behave, they have tried to hijack feminism, the feminist agenda, by saying, we stand for Muslim women's rights. So we are actually protectors of Muslim women. And that is where Kashmir also, of course, comes in. But before that, I'll just mention, issues like this instant triple talaq. So divorce provisions in Muslim personal law in India. One of the provisions, which is quite discredited and rarely used, but it did exist till the Supreme Court discontinued it, announced that it would not be constitutional anymore, that allowed a Muslim husband to just say, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you 3 times in order to divorce his wife. So this was made a big issue by the Hindu right-wing groups who tried to drown out the voice of Muslim women who were already agitating on this issue and who were taking up this issue. So they tried to make it, they tried to invisibilize the Muslim women, the Muslim feminists who were actually leading the struggle against triple talaq, or even against polygamy in Muslim communities, and demanding more rights in terms of maintenance and so on. So they tried to say, it is BJP who is protecting Muslim women and so on. Of course, the minute Muslim women actually come forward and start leading movements like the movement against the Citizenship Amendment Act, the BJP sings a different tune, paints them all from old women to young women. They try to say, oh, they are paid, they are taking money, they are sluts, they are, you name it. They are, of course, anti-national and all of that. Kashmir also, and I feel slightly uncomfortable sort of speaking so briefly here, and that too me speaking about Kashmir, because I think that, in fact, it would merit a separate session where we could listen to Kashmiri feminists on the issue, and I'm sure that opportunity will arise also. But of course, in order to justify all that has been done in Kashmir, and not just the BJP government, of course, Kashmir, the history of the Indian state's involvement in Kashmir and its repressive hold over Kashmir, that goes back a very long way. And there has always been this idea of trying to build some kind of feminist, you know, justification for presence in Kashmir and the presence even of the army in Kashmir and so on. So the notion that the army is there to protect rather than to, control. So that has always been there. But, and of course, especially protect Muslim women, Kashmiri women. But after the abrogation of Article 370, the Modi government actually played this in a very specific way, where BJP leaders, in the build-up to this abrogation, said that, look, there are laws that are allowed in Kashmir, which are specific to Kashmir. For instance, about who can own property and who can buy property and who can inherit property. And those some of those laws are tilted against Kashmiri women. So they tried to say that those laws are in operation only because of Article 370. And they also lied by implying that there are not similar laws in other states in India. No, that is not true. In fact, among Adivasi communities, there are laws that are of a similar nature, which do prevail as well. So there are, culture-specific laws that do exist, and it is for women within those communities to say what they would like to, how they would like to see those laws change. But BJP did not do that. That's one thing they argued about. And the other thing is, of course, that they also did this whole attempt to hijack the campaign against Section 377, which was the law that outlawed homosexual relationships. And they tried to say that, see, that law has been abrogated, that law has been read down by the Supreme Court in India, but it will continue to be in operation in Kashmir because of Article 370. And so, everybody who is supporting Article 370's continuation are homophobic. Of course, that's a big lie. And we would turn around and tell them that the only people who are arguing for the continuation of 377 in Kashmir is the Indian Army chief, who is saying that inside the Indian Army, not just in Kashmir, but all over India, inside the Indian Army, for us, anybody who's homosexual is going to be punished, penalized, etc., because we can't allow all this nonsense inside our army and so on. So it is only the Indian Army, the only institution in the whole of India, and of course in Kashmir also, where of course. So we will, of course, hear more about this, I'm sure, from Insha. The other thing I wanted to briefly mention is that I noticed that when Article 370 was abrogated, then when we raised concerns, when concerns were raised about how there was this complete clampdown, the whole of Kashmir has been turned into a prison, and it still continues to be like that, where information, there is a clampdown on information, there is a clampdown on communication, there is a clampdown on, of course, the right to protest and everything else. So when we would say this, then you had Indian journalists, quite prominent Indian journalists, liberal journalists, who would say that, look, you have to do this because you have to protect lives. And they would point out that in 2016, before such curbs were put on protests and so on, so many Kashmiri lives were lost. And you had to point out that Kashmiri lives were lost not because they were coming out and doing something violent or harming themselves. The Kashmiris were killed by security personnel in police as well as armed forces, who came out and shot people, unarmed people who were protesting on the streets. So this notion of protection, where women are also told, of course, women are in South Asia are familiar with this, that you are told that you have to be locked up for your own protection. We have to take away your rights for your own protection. I think that this is said by the Indian state to Kashmiris all the time, of course, especially to Kashmiri women, but to all Kashmiris, certainly. And Also, the idea that human rights violations should not be talked about in international fora because, so it's exactly like domestic violence shouldn't be talked about outside the family because you'll be giving a bad name to the family. So the idea is that anyone who discusses human rights issues in India, in Kashmir, is somebody who is against India because you are giving India a bad name. Even those who talk about oxygen shortage now, of course, are being told, oh, you are giving India a bad name because you're giving the government of India a bad name. And also, I should say that if you look at that's almost my last point. I think I must have taken a lot of time. The laws which many Indian states ruled by the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is India's ruling party, that they have tried to enact these laws which have tried to prevent, outlaw interfaith relationships. So they claim that these are ordinances against love jihad, which means that every relationship of a Hindu man with a Muslim woman of a Muslim man with a Hindu woman is basically something which is an attack on Hindu community and on Hindu women. So to protect these women, we have to do this. But if you look at the fine print of the law, you see the similarity with what's happening in Kashmir as well, and of course here as well. So what the law says is that which are the communities which are protected? So they say women, Hindu women, they say Dalits, they say Adivasis. What do they have to be protected from? They have to be protected from forced conversion. So forced conversion for any purpose. So for marriage, if a Hindu woman wants to become a Muslim and marry a Muslim man, that. But also they say that mass conversion. So if a large number of Dalits or Adivasis say we want to convert to Islam or to Christianity, then they also have to be protected from this kind of coercive conversion. How do you know it's coercive? They'll have to say so, right? No, because this law actually has provisions to punish the women and the Dalits and the Adivasis who engage in such conversions if they convert without taking permission from the local district authority. So the idea is that the state decides, the state has a right to take decisions about faith and about marriage, which are very personal decisions to people. And under such a law, if Dr. Ambedkar was here today, getting a whole lot of Dalits, encouraging them to convert to Buddhism, he will also would be in jail under this law. So I'll stop here because I think I've probably taken quite a lot of time, but we can always come back to any issues that we've left out later.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Kavita. You covered so much actually in a relatively short time, and particularly in this moment of real crisis, sort of pulling out the kind of deeper connections is something we really need to do. I'm going to move on quite quickly now to hand over to Insha. So just to introduce her, I agree with Kavita that a whole panel is necessary to talk about Kashmiri feminism, but I think we're very lucky to have with us Dr. Insha Malik, who is an independent researcher based in Afghanistan. She's also a visiting professor at University of Washington. She was awarded her PhD from the Center for Comparative Politics and Political Theory, School of International Studies at JNU. She's a former Fox Fellow at Yale University, and her book, Muslim Women, Agency and Resistance Politics, The Case of Kashmir, was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2019. And I'd just like to say that this is really a very groundbreaking book, which foregrounds the voices of Kashmiri women as political actors historically, and questions the whole binary of agency and victimhood within which Muslim women have been constructed, as well as placing struggles against patriarchy at the heart of resistance against Indian rule. So Insha's research interests include political theory, history of Islam, political movements, internet activism, and gender studies in Central and South Asia, particularly India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Kashmir. So I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you so much, Kalpana, for that very long introduction. I think it covered almost everything. And I particularly thank Kavita for really foregrounding this conversation and, where I can take it from here. I think to begin to speak about Kashmir and Kashmiri women, it's important to look at the experiences or important to actually center what Kashmiris feel or think, because that for me is the centrality of the question of agency, if we ask. So for me personally, the question of Indian feminism and Kashmiri women was particularly interesting when I started to explore these questions as a student when I was studying in India. And I think what's important to understand was that it was only in my interaction with people in India that I first realized that being Muslim was such an important thing, because until I was in Kashmir, it was never such a big question for me. So this is to only point out to the fact that how within Indian culture, I was already experiencing, or I've already seen a certain kind of Islamophobia that is underpinning the kind of contestation that exists between Hindus and Muslims, particularly the one that is exploited by the current political establishment, but also not really addressed in previous secular governments that exist. And then when we talk about Kashmir, especially its history, its post-colonial history, if we say, quote unquote, it's more so contested and it's more so rife with different kinds of narratives that are trying to construct Kashmiris in its very precise connection with the political ideology and establishment of India. So to give a brief sense, that Kashmir itself is a complex society which has had influences throughout history from big movements in the East and the West and the Chinese influence and whatnot, because it is basically a silk route that existed on a very vibrant trade route for about thousands of years. So what you see about Kashmir is a kind of a complex society which is not particularly defined by religion. But I think it's important to mention that Kashmiris were probably the first people to experience a Hindu rule much before modern India came into existence, which is the Dogra Hindu rule, under which the British have sold Kashmir to the Dogras, and then the Dogras took over Kashmir and ruled it by enforcing a particular kind of Hindu rule over a majority Muslim population. So what I'm pointing out is that somehow the basis of an Orientalistic view of Kashmir is rooted in how Kashmir was transferred from the British to the Hindus, and that body of knowledge and the politic of knowledge about Kashmir and the region as an exotic territory that needs to be explored and that needs to be controlled, or as we see, protected in case of women. It's a sort of inheritance that sits really well with the ideology of India. And I say India, and do excuse me, I don't want to sound extremist in this case, but I say India is because it's a kind of inheritance that plagues both the right as well as the left-wing political dispensations in India. And having said that, when I first explored the kind of interventionist feminism that existed in Kashmir, which is to say in early 1980s, when Kashmir was extremely militarized and Indian troopers were brought in to control the homegrown insurgency that was supposed to question how the transfer of power had happened in Kashmir and how Kashmiris who had demanded self-determination up until that point were ignored or were not basically given any way to address that question. And what we see after 1989 is a kind of a very robust militarization of civil society and general social culture and political culture in Kashmir. And this sort of rampant militarization has led to the breakdown of social structures where women basically had to fit into the shoes, to protect their families, to protect themselves against very heavy militarization. So the view from Kashmir of Kashmiri women is not necessarily the view that you have when you look at Kashmir from the point of view of India. So what was happening was in early 1980s, after a mass uprising after a mass armed struggle, a lot of Indian feminists were coming to Kashmir to understand what Kashmiri women go through. And so a lot of writings would explore that how Kashmiri women are basically just victims who are trapped between two competing patriarchies, and that those competing patriarchies are that of the militants and the soldiers, But what was kind of ignored in those writings was that the kind of emasculation that Kashmiri indigeneity and Kashmiri culture overall had faced in the face of sort of rampant militarization. Only if we look at just August 5, right now, India has stationed almost 900,000 Indian troopers in Kashmir, which is like massive, So to understand the repercussions of such a heavy militarization on people and their psyche, it needs more than what was offered in those writings to begin with. So when we look at Kashmir and Kashmiri women, their experiential accounts are not necessarily accounts of victimhood, though there is a large-scale subjection, large-scale violence that permeates in the society. But you still see that women have articulated their political freedom as well as their personal freedom in movements and in anecdotes that question the kind of repressive and authoritarian behavior that India has shown in Kashmir. So when we talk about the current dispensation, especially the Modi government, I think it's important to see that the Hindu nationalism or Hindutva nationalism, it's kind of sustained by a culture of apathy, a culture where millions of people are rendered voiceless and without rights, for the simple fact that it's a kind of a political dispensation where if you raise your voice, you could get punished, like Kavita was already pointing out, that you can't even say something is going wrong. And if we look at perhaps the philosophical works of Arendt, and we constantly come face to face with the idea that if people have lost the ability to even understand what's right and what's wrong, in a condition or in a culture, it's very difficult to then really guide people towards something which is more helpful in these circumstances. So from that point of view, what we see happening in India, especially now with the COVID-19 and with the kind of repressive situation that we have, is basically just an outcome of a sort of like years of oppressive tactics and years of oppressive politics that has led to a certain moment right now. Somehow, what I was also discovering in my research and in my understanding was that a lot of the narrative about Muslim women in general, and then about Kashmiri women in particular, were first, of course, it's an inheritance of colonialism, but also more modern forms of how we understand Muslim women globally. Like I remember we talked about how does it connect to the global understanding of colonization and settler colonialism. What we see is that similar tropes have been used to define, for instance, to look at Kashmiri women as well. Especially after August 5 in 2019, we see a surge of Indian right-wing men who, even publicly in media, they were talking about how they should go to Kashmir and marry Kashmiri women because they need protection or they need help or they are victims. So, which is very contrary to how Kashmiri women see themselves or how they have experienced life. But the way media as well as political dispensation is kind of supported and created to push these narratives is basically only to aid settler colonization of Kashmiris to the extent that they don't have, I mean, even if they have a voice, but they don't have any means to register that voice. And particularly after 2019, it's very difficult for Kashmiris to find spaces as well as possibilities to speak out. As of now, we have over 10 million population, and half of the Kashmiri population doesn't get passports to travel. Only if they have had any history of anyone being a protester or activist in the family, you are denied to travel outside of Kashmir, which means there are very few Kashmiris who can speak out against the kind of violence and repression that they are facing. And so women are no exception in that as well. Like, I mean, for the last 2 years, the schools have been closed, not just during COVID, but before, due to the lockdown imposed after, I mean, it wasn't even after, it was even before we started, before they actually started repealing the act. There was sort of, the lockdown, and there was all of these repressive tactics that were already undergoing in Kashmir. And now it's been 2 years almost that students have not been to schools, colleges. They can't, women cannot access properly, like, forums of education or even connections that are not authorized by certain political or state approval, to the point that even people who are working right now in the administration in Kashmir, which after it has been made a union territory, they have to produce their social media reports to the government or to their offices that shows that they haven't said anything resentful or anything against the government, so that they can get their salaries at the end of the day. At the same time, you have people who, you have a kind of a unique settler colonization going on, where people from the administration are being dismissed. Like, if you're working in a bank, you're being removed so that an Hindu mainlander can get that job. So even though we're saying that Amarnath Yatra has been, hold off and it hasn't gone there, but tourists have been going to Kashmir even during COVID-19. So it's like, it's a kind of a very repressive situation that is just underway. And it's going on despite the COVID-19. That hasn't stopped any of what's happening in Kashmir. There are serial orders for removal of Kashmiris from different organizations, different institutions to be replaced by. The land is up for sale. Just today, I received a notification about land in business estates or in industrial area is up for sale. All of this is happening while people are actually dying in Kashmir, in rest of India, and of course in Kashmir as well because of COVID-19. And all of this process is still continuing, and the kind of mission that the Modi government is on about annexing Kashmiri land, that's clearly there. It's happening and it's going on. So Kashmiri women perhaps would need, if we talk about solidarity, I don't want to go on and on because I know there's a lot to discuss, but I think a true solidarity would be to acknowledge the condition, the political condition of Kashmiri women, which is very different from Muslim women in the rest of India, for the fact that Kashmir is not a normal state. It is an annexed occupation, a military occupation, a brutal one on that. And therefore, the conditions of women are very different from what women in the rest of India have faced. So any true solidarity, I think, would begin by not just focusing on the religious identity of Kashmiri women, but also on the political condition that not just Kashmiri women, but also Kashmiris in general are suffering through. And I think that it's kind of dystopic for me, just to respond to what Kavita is describing about what's happening in India, because that's like what we as Kashmiris have experienced all of our life. So it's not really just because Modi has come to power, because it has been happening for almost 60 years in different ways and forms to completely erode a nation's distinct identity and remove their institutions and political measures to create a sort of what is in the very crude way a sort of land grab, which is unfortunate because I don't think it's going to stop there if we continue to have an authoritarian political dispensation based on a vision or an exclusionary or an extremist vision of Hindu religion. I think there's going to be more exclusions, not just for Kashmiris, but for many other nations within India. I'll stop here because I know I'm talking all over the place because there's so much to say. It's a very complex issue, but yeah, I'm very happy to answer questions and discuss further.
Thank you so much, Insha. I think you really conveyed so many things so powerfully in that, and I think one of the many things which came across was how the abrogation is, it is so much also about the materiality, the economics of it, the seizure of land. And the kind of, as you said, new kinds of settlement, new kinds of displacement, and so on. And I thought I'd just start off by myself asking you both a question, and please also feel free to kind of speak to each other and ask each other anything you want to. But I just wanted to start with Insha again by just asking you, you talked about, and you've also written about this whole question of Kashmiri women's resistance. And I just wondered if you could, you said how, this takes a form which is kind of hidden, it's not recognized, it's invisibilized in various ways. But, at the same time, the women that you spoke to, for example, when you were writing your book, they were very open about it and very explicit about it. So I just wondered if you could say a little more. You also say that their narratives, in that sense, are very different from those of men around, for example, Kunan, Pushpura, and so on. So I just wondered if you could maybe elaborate on that a little, and we can look at that in the context of what you said about the need for solidarity, which actually recognizes that and recognizes the specificity of what Kashmiri women are facing, and also the way they are resisting.
Thank you so much for that question. I do have to say that I feel a bit compelled to speak that since I've written this book, Kashmir is unrecognizable for me because the kind of politics that existed before August 19 is a kind of politics that is almost non-existent right now. Because if you may remember, or you may be familiar, that when the Article 370 was removed, the first people to be imprisoned were the entire leadership in Kashmir. So on both sides, the pro-India politicians were also put behind the bars, and of course, pro-freedom leadership was also behind the bars. And what we see after that is a constant hunting down of women and activists and scholars and writers. A lot of scholars had to really go into hiding. A lot of scholars, even PhD scholars, are behind bars and they're killed. So it's a very extreme kind of repression that we have faced after 2019. So sometimes I do feel a bit, disorientated about talking about the kind of politics that I discuss in the book. But nevertheless, knowing the spirit of Kashmiri women and how they have continued under such brutal and very repressive regime, I think it's important to realize that, or even discuss that how women, through various sorts of political activisms, whether it's the activism of using, particularly when we talk about Islam and Kashmir, I think it's an important question to address. Kashmiris, I think, feel that they are punished for their Muslim identity, and that, the entire complex history of Kashmiris, you would see that when, in the 11th century, when Kashmiris converted to Islam, is seen as a moment which is very treacherous. It's somehow a kind of sin that has, happened. And perhaps what has also been a sort of obsession is that Muslim identity or that Islamic identity itself has burdened the scholarship on Kashmir to the point that we have never looked at Kashmiri women or their politics beyond the prism of religion. And even if we are, even if they have employed religion in different political practices, we have not cared about what is the meaning of those practices in the context in which they exist. So what I did was I interviewed a lot of women from different eras and from different political persuasions, and I looked at why they were talking about freedom or why they were talking about women's rights in the discourses that they were. I think a lot of it is shaped, a lot of our resistance in Kashmir is shaped by the experiences that we've had with the state. So if you tell a Kashmiri, why are you so religious? Or why is religious identity important? They're going to point you to the state, because it's the state that has problem with my identity. So it becomes a question. So, recently there was a massive protest that came out of women fully clad in burqas and abayas, and they just came out in the streets and they were protesting a fashion show, which was held by the army during COVID-19. Of course, there was a fashion show where Kashmiri models were brought in. And as against that, we had a very massive protest of women wearing all these burqas, and they came out on the road and they protested it. And a lot of well-meaning feminists and even Kashmiri feminists were saying, oh, this is very repressive. Why are we so religious? Why should we? But that's only a symptom. They're actually pointing you to something. They're not the problem. They are actually symptomatically showing you what's wrong with the political dispensation in Kashmir. Why are we in the subcontinent are obsessed with religion, including our government, including the government in India. So they are looking at that face. So they are distrusting the Hindu armed masculinity and its vision for Kashmiri Muslim women. What is the vision really? The vision is to protect them, and how? By getting married to them or sexually exploiting them or pushing them into prostitution, which is the situation that Kashmiri women had to grapple with. So kind of politics of piety and morality in Kashmir's context is within the ambit of a very masculine, very militarized patriarchy, Hindu patriarchy of the army, which has, the provisions to enter your house, to rape you, or rape your husband, or to kill your husband, to do anything under the sun to you. The only protection you may feel is the protection of a veil. And you don't have anything. You don't have the state structure. You don't have the laws. You don't have anywhere to go and register a complaint and say this has happened, because this is what we have historically seen, that all of these cases that went to the courts were actually, cases against the Indian army, whether they were cases of rape, whether they were cases of exploitation. The trials have gone on for 20 years. And then the army has straight away taken the case to the army court and we're never heard again. So there's a historical breakdown of any justice mechanism. So people have only religion to turn to. And when they go to their religion, they try to find a sort of restitution, a sort of respite to fight back against the injustices that have been levied against them. So these women, they are very aware of how, the de-traditionalization took place in Kashmir with a very violent interaction with the army, and then how they have to navigate the patriarchy, whether it's the social patriarchy or it's the militarized patriarchy of the army. They have to navigate all of these to be able to craft a certain politics for themselves, which can allow them to really have a voice. And I think Atharzia's work, which is fascinating as well, which is about how women participate in morning protests especially women who lost their husbands, they've lost their sons, their kith and kin have been disappeared by the Indian Army. And they don't, I mean, how through mourning they try to keep alive a question that's deliberately sort of shoved under the rug by the Indian state consistently for last 30, 40 years. So basically when we remove the kind of blinders that we have self-imposed on ourselves and immerse ourselves into the Kashmiri situation of militarization and understand the social, cultural, political, as well as religious institutions, how they have been and how they have been broken down over the period of time. For instance, Modi government's biggest agenda to go to Kashmir was that it's economically backward, which is absolutely untrue, because I think in the north, Kashmir is the only state, if you compare it with UP, you compare it with so many northern states, was doing much, much better on so many indicators, social indicators. And once, after the annexation, what we've seen is the complete collapse of Kashmir local economy. It's people have incurred so many economic losses, especially the farmers, because there's more push towards a neoliberal sort of agenda where you want to bring in the rich people and, have them exploit the kind of resources that they may find. And the local networks, they are much more gagged and under pressure. So there's a sort of the new trend that you see is to economically break down Kashmiri society, which is seen as a kind of backbone of Kashmiri resistance. And of course, within those, you see that women aren't simply the kind of cultural symbols that's how Islamophobia or Islamophobic imagery about Muslim women has been, to look at them only as sort of cultural symbols, which they haven't been. And particularly the book or my work is to really highlight and point out the political, social, historical, and cultural factors that go into creating Kashmiri women beyond the kind of exotic understanding that we have of them as very beautiful women who need protection and saving of, Hindu men. So I think that was my focus, and that's consistently what I've tried to do through my work. I hope that answered your question. Sorry, I do go on a tangent.
No, not at all. I think, you've, I think that's covered some really important questions. And I think, also made it even clearer why, it can be understood in a colonial context as well, because there are obviously so many kind of parallels which can be drawn. And if we're talking about, partly about Europe as well, there are a lot of things to think about in terms of the way in which constructions of Muslim women are operating in Europe, but also taking your point, of course, that Kashmiri women does not simply mean Muslim women, and it's very important to recognize that. I just come into Kavita now. I think just picking up as well on Insha mentioned about neoliberalism, and obviously something you've talked about a lot is this kind of intersection with the kind of patriarchy of Hindutva and its kind of the way in which it's wedded to neoliberalism. So I just wondered if you wanted to maybe say something about that, and also pick up a bit more on this whole question of demography. And again, this is something which Insha also may want to come back on, because it's such a preoccupation, and it is obviously so much also about women's bodies, about women as reproducing the nation, or reproducing some kind of threat to the nation. And I think so. I just wondered if you'd like to come back on that, Kavita.
You want me to go? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So I think that one of the things which I had thought I'll speak about briefly was this whole thing that in India, attack on women's autonomy is really a very prominent form of violence. And in fact, a lot of, because sexual violence gets a lot more press, you can say, international press as well. What happens is that sexual violence is given a very disproportionate space. That's not to say that sexual violence is not a very pressing issue. It is. But the idea that in the name of protecting women from sexual violence, you can take away their autonomy, and especially their autonomy in terms of their right to decide who they will have a relationship with, that is something which is pretty widespread across communities in India. And what we find is that it is not just a cultural thing. It's quite actively promoted by the state and also by corporations. So you have these factories which are producing for big corporate garment brands and so on, which employ women. And what they do there is that they they say, oh, you can't, women workers here cannot use mobile phones and they cannot go outside and have a good time. They have to stay inside a hostel. So they're virtually imprisoned. If you ask them why are you imprisoning them, then the answer is invariably that, oh, it's because their parents want it this way. This is for their safety. And safety is code for basically they shouldn't be free to just, fall in love, break the caste and get involved, get married, get pregnant, whatever. But the other thing is also, of course, the unspoken thing is that why is the corporation doing it? They're doing it because they know that if you don't, you are also successfully preventing them from organizing, from being able to organize, from being able to speak to people from other factories, workers, male workers, men and women from other factories, and just, have a social life in which they can bond with people. And that is where, after all, the confidence to protest and so on comes from. So you can see how the something that Hindutva actively promotes, the idea of protecting women, being a sleight of hand for basically taking away their freedoms in the name, so their autonomous decision, a Hindu woman's autonomous decision to be in a relationship with a Muslim man, that is just completely invisibilized. And the Hindutva lot will say, oh, she's a victim of love jihad, and we have to rescue her. So you are abducting her away from the relationship she wants to hold. And you're doing it violently. And yet you are able to say that we are the rescuers. This is what Hindutva does. But this same thing overlaps with the interests of, corporate interests, global corporate interests as well. So that is something which you can say that in the neoliberal framework, of course, it is there. The other thing is also, I think that feminism, as it's understood in a neoliberal framework, is sometimes very individual centric. So the refusal to see things in any structural way at all, right? For instance, that example that Insha gave. Now, if the Indian army is hosting something, right? Or if a feminist, if a girls' rock band basically plays for the Indian army in Kashmir, then what has to be understood is that the protests against this are invariably framed, especially by Indian liberal feminist voices, as being anti-feminist. So the protests are basically anti-feminist, whereas you are completely refusing to see that it is not that simple, that the protests are against the fact that these groups are performing for the army. And of course, there are, which is obviously with good reason seen as an oppressive force there. But the point is that there may be, Kashmiri society also does not have one voice. They also have multiple voices. And of course, there may be sections there which are trying to create a politics which is, more anti-feminist. But the point is that you have to be able to distinguish between, Kashmiri feminist voices and how and different political voices in Kashmir, right? You cannot, make it all out to be. Somebody's asked a question about stone pelting, and I just wanted to say that there are a couple of very good, very interesting write-ups. I remember that I think there's an interview or a write-up by S.R. Batul where she talks about Kashmiri girls pelting stones, and there are these images of them, with a football in one hand and stones in the other. The point is that they haven't come out planning to do that. They have suddenly been confronted. They are girls in a school playing football, and when they have been suddenly confronted with army violence or armed forces violence, they have responded by, so it is an assertion. It's a feminist assertion as well, and of course it is also an assertion against this repressive force. So there's all of that. I just wanted to briefly respond to that question as well.
Thanks, Kavita. I think we should probably move on to some of the questions and open it up to the audience. So if you have a question, please do put it in the Q&A, which is just at the middle of the bottom of your screen. And we already have a couple of questions. Kavita partly responded to Alina's question about throwing stones. She's also asked how women and girls are affected by pellet guns. And we also have a question from Mariye Mushtaq about Kashmiri women are not able to fully access international procedures and systems, such as UNSC resolutions for women in armed conflicts 1325, etc. So what role does India's foreign policy, particularly with regards to Kashmir, play to keep Kashmiri women at a disadvantage in that sense? So yeah, Insha, did you want to respond on either of those? Yeah.
Sure. I think the first question that Elena asked, there has been a substantial reportage after 2016, where in 2016 alone, there were more than 6,000 people who were either blinded or wounded because of pellet guns, and a significant number of them were women as well. So the kind of military violence that Kashmiris are subjected to, it's indiscriminate. It doesn't discriminate on the basis of gender. So women are as likely to be killed as, perhaps not as likely, but women are also killed in protests, and they are also shot because, they've received a stray bullet. They were just hanging out by the window. So women have been a significant casualty in the war. And in addition to that, yes, pellet guns have raised quite a bit of havoc, and they continue to do so. And there are no legal political measures in place to raise voices against the kind of oppressions that Kashmiris are subjected to as a community or as a collective. And that relates to Maria's question as well, because Kashmir is more like a prison, because it has been cut out or cut off from its traditional, connection routes, whether it's with the rest of, Kashmir in the Pakistani side, or if it's with, the natural connections it has with Pakistan or Afghanistan or any of the Central Asian countries. That has meant that Kashmiris actually have to travel to Delhi to get out of India. So they're not able to travel outside of Kashmir without a sort of significant approval or a procedure within, the Indian system. So I think it's the only state under, perhaps, or only place, if you would see in India, that has to go through the center or the central command to be basically access anywhere outside. And what has also happened historically is that India has denied international bodies, whether they are UN, whether they are, we do have a military observatory, as much as I remember, that now it's like all retired Indian Army officers who work there as a part-time job or something. So you don't expect anything good coming out from there. And journalists also have limited access. So I think that one of the significant failures for Kashmir is that it has not, or it has been deliberately kept away from the kind of international provisions the international law can offer. to address the kind of inhumanity or inhuman conditions that Kashmiris have been left in. So I definitely think that these resolutions are inaccessible so far. And I think this could be one of the possibility where engagement internationally or globally is required to put pressure on the Indian government to gain access to Kashmir in one way or the other. I think that would be something useful.
Okay, and we have a question from Sarvjit Johal, where she asks how the militarization and repression in Kashmir is affecting families in terms of new structures being set up by women to survive economically. Are family structures changing? I mean, I guess this is linked to, mass imprisonment of men and that kind of thing. So would you like to say anything about that?
Sure. I mean, Kashmiri society in general, after 1989, I think has gone through a significant detraditionalization through violence. That is, women have been pushed out to work more in the public sphere. But still, they have to fall back on a kind of alternative ideas of sovereignty. And what I mean alternative ideas of sovereignty, they still have to kind of create community buffers for themselves, knowing very well that they don't have institutions to protect them. So, and also some of the alternatives that exist are the religious institutions in Kashmir, whether they are Waqf or Awqaf, as we call them, that has tried to reach out to women that are in need of aid. So what happens is basically people will collect aid and they would offer it to people who are in need, especially if their structures have been destroyed by the army or they have been subjected to kind of repressive politics in one way or the other. People will assemble, they will put money together and they will help each other out. That's how Kashmiris have survived 60 years of occupation. So yes, but apart from that, also, I think what one doesn't know and understand about Kashmir is that it's a very society. Even under conflict, under repression, and under such occupation, we've had significantly higher literacy rates than rest of the. They find jobs, they work, and if that means also working, from home and doing stuff or engaging in artworks, they do that. So I think they cope, but I think the way the violence has changed society, I think it's more visible in terms of the psychological and social impact that women and families have suffered from.
Okay, I think we are kind of gradually coming to the end of our time, but I think
I can see some of the questions. I've seen all the questions there.
Yeah, we have. I don't know if there are any other questions that either of you would like to respond to.
There's a question by Sean
Do you want to answer that?
Yes, I could respond to that. So shall I go?
Yeah, go ahead.
So there is a question, Sean has asked about the possibility of retribution, that we might face. Of course, I'm not speaking for anyone else, but certainly, see, this is a constant thing which anybody in India who is speaking on any forum whatsoever, whether in India or to an international forum like this, they're expected to be, ready for some kind of vindictive action by the Indian state. Absolutely. And I think that all of us who speak publicly now, especially on fora where we know that this is public, this is being live streamed or whatever it is, even if it's a public street on which we're speaking, we are likely to be choosing our words very carefully. We are likely to be, using words which are avoiding certain kinds of trigger words. I will say that quite honestly here, that absolutely that is the case, and it's a reality that we all have to face up to. The point is that many people in India have been picked up and jailed. For instance, all these protesters who are in prison, all they did was to organize protests. So the very fact that they were part of WhatsApp groups where they were coordinating protests. So any kind of coordination, is seen as conspiracy, is painted as conspiracy. The government, of course, knows that this is not a conspiracy, but they are able to get away with saying this is a conspiracy, even though there is no evidence whatsoever of any involvement in violence or conspiracy. So, they could well say that I'm part of an international conspiracy here because I'm speaking to all of you. And that goes for Insha or for anyone, they can do that. Kalpana had just asked one question, which I wanted to briefly respond to, which I didn't, about demography. I just wanted to briefly flag this, that if anybody's interested, they should read up on what is happening in India under the rubric of population control, especially under the Modi government. There's lots to be said about what happened before Modi. But under Modi specifically, this has taken on, especially in this new term, the idea that it is supposed to be controlling of Muslim population. So you've had ministers in the Modi cabinet say this in public speeches, basically openly say that Muslims are, so the idea of Muslims being, breeding too much. So Modi has said this in his speeches right from his Gujarat days in disgusting ways. And of course, now they're trying to create this idea that a policy of population control is needed and that should be aimed at Muslim families. And of course, even this business about interfaith marriage is seen in that sense, where if a Muslim man marries a Hindu woman, then the idea is that, oh, she's going to bear Muslim children and so increase the numbers of Muslims. Needless to say, the demographic bogey of Muslims outnumbering Hindus and so on in India, that's absolute nonsense. Anyone who understands basic, mathematics and statistics would know that this is rubbish. But this is the way in which they do this kind of thing. Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll have to take the last questions now, which I'm going to combine, the remaining question. One is the one which is in the chat. From Anubandh, which is really asking about the similarities and differences. It's rather a broad question, but between situation of Muslim women in India, Pakistan, Kashmir, and Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. So I don't know if there's any element of that you want to take, perhaps about the two parts of Kashmir, and then. Finally, a question which maybe we could end on is Mari's question about can Kashmir feminists and Indian feminists work together for a common goal to end the military occupation in the region, or will such an alliance reproduce marginalization? So yeah, I'm going to just leave those open to both of you. Yeah. Insha, did you want to say anything about this question about the different situation, different regions?
Yeah, I think this is a very broad question, and I also think that comparisons have to be, comparisons themselves are about, very, very complex conditions in which women find themselves. I think that if we look at Indian occupied Kashmir and then we look at Pakistan occupied Kashmir, I don't think we have any significant data in terms of comparing the lives on one side or the other. So I would not be in a position to say one is better than other. But what I can say is that I have read some works and have talked to people in Pakistan occupied Kashmir. What I have realized is that on both sides of Kashmir, there is a discontent. On the Indian side, there's not a discontent. There's a full-fledged resistance to Indian domination and rule, a very vocal one. And in the Pakistani side, I think there's there are a lot of concerns about what's happening on the Indian side. And at the same time, there are concerns about limited political rights that people have. They're obviously not killed. There's not rampant militarization as we see on the Indian side. But yes, Pakistan also tries to control the political and stifles the political voices of pro-freedom Kashmiris on that side as well. And in terms of women's position, situation, I don't think that if you look at, Indian occupied Kashmir, and then you compare it to the Pakistani side, it's a historical comparison in the sense that Kashmir's center was always Indian occupied Kashmir. That means it was always an urban, more developed and more elite part of Kashmir, like the center. Srinagar city, which is the city which is the capital, has been the capital for almost 8,000 years. So any comparison to any other parts of Kashmir anywhere else would be very ahistorical in that sense. But I do know also that on the other side, people have mostly stronger links with the UK, and they have, because of the migration and migratory practices, there's a lot more education and it's more developed than maybe the rest of Pakistan. So in that case, it's not very different from this side either. One significant difference that I see, perhaps as a Kashmiri and not as a scholar, is the cultural and social difference, I think, between Kashmir and India and Pakistan definitely exists. Kashmiris do see themselves outside of India and Pakistan, not inside of it, culturally speaking. And that has roots in the history of the region and how people have articulated their identities and how they have thought of themselves part of that larger subcontinent. For instance, I'm sure Kavita already knows, Kashmir was the first region to end feudalism in entire continent. We had our first labor movement in 1825, so we were very progressive people for the longest part of our history, and unfortunately, that knowledge of Kashmir doesn't come out, and we don't really know that very well. But I feel that this is an opportunity for all of us to learn. To speak to the second question that Mari poses, that I think Kashmiri feminists are happy to collaborate, to offer insights, to offer their knowledge, to seek solidarities from Indian feminists, from feminists all over the world, to be able to raise the concerns of what ordinary Kashmiri women face every day in Kashmir. So definitely, yes.
You're muted, Kavita.
Sorry. Yeah, I'll just quickly answer the question that Marie asked. I'll answer this more in terms of, I think, quickly trying to share very briefly what kind of work we do try to do in India vis-a-vis the Kashmir question. See, the problem is that in India, it isn't just about those who identify as feminists being willing to work with Kashmiri feminists on this question. I think the question becomes, how do you continually engage with, a public in India, which is fed a lot of disinformation and communal, Islamophobic disinformation, violent myths about Kashmir and Kashmiri people, right? So you are speaking to, I think the challenge is always, how do you speak to and persuade a larger number of people in India, and large numbers, not small groups alone, about how to view this question differently. So it is not so much in terms of how can we help Kashmiri women, it's more, or Kashmiri activists. It's more in terms of even as activists in our own right here, wherever we operate in different parts of India. The point is that even there, you can't possibly say that you are, you are doing any form of democratic, let alone feminist politics, if you're not trying to counter the disinformation here and trying to persuade people to look with a sense of solidarity towards Kashmir and Kashmiri activism. So that is absolutely clear. And that work is something that my organization, for instance, has done, primarily by inviting Kashmiri activists to come and speak to women in our areas of work, and to basically encourage a dialogue to happen there, to break down a whole wall of Islamophobic lies about so many things. Like somebody asked a question about stone pelting, for instance. So how do you address all of that? Because there's a continuous flow from Indian television and Indian politicians, which is extremely violent and hostile. Also, I should say that any group that does this work does it in constant danger of state intervention. One of the groups that does work on this question in villages in India is the Human Rights Forum in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. And just recently, there has been a raid on several of their activists' homes, and several of their activists have been picked up and are threatened with arrest under the UAPA law. So I just want, and many of those meetings that they have held on Kashmir in villages and so on have faced crackdowns and all of that. So, that work which is done here is also done under those circumstances. It's very difficult to do it in a very public way, announcing one's intent openly and so on. It has to be done with great care. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to speak to the point that Kavita said about how difficult it is to actually voice, anything about Kashmir. And I can imagine now, especially when talking about anything has become difficult. I think the Kashmiris, they understand what repression is, and because they are, they have been accustomed to getting, making them basically violent at the gunpoint even. I think what Kashmir done for at least past 10 years that I witnessed is to speak despite of the fear.
Yeah.
That is what we need right now. I think Kashmiris have made that fairly clear that at the cost of their own lives, they have tried to speak against the undemocratization that has existed in Kashmir. And then, which of course by default is spreading and will spread if not contested or if not resisted. I think that the fear perhaps that is experienced now more by Indian activists is something that Kashmiris have lived with. So if Kashmiris show a sort of pragmatic approach towards solidarity, it's because we definitely understand on our skin what it means to resist and what is really waiting for you. But I don't think there is ever going to be another opportune moment to question the general apathy on which the state system in India has been built, which is to marginalize the ordinary people and marginalize nations within India into a certain kind of authoritarian rhetoric, and to define them as if they were all, the tweeting robots that we have now on Twitter, to kill the diversity that has existed in this region. And I'm talking about Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, which are really vibrant countries. So I think this is the opportune moment to really push for these solidarities. And I think Kashmir really shows us the way in terms of how to resist, and also how they have, at the cost of everything, still try to talk about the undemocratic.
I fully agree with what Insha said. I just want to in one sentence clarify that I think that courage is there, and groups that I mentioned are actually doing that. The point is that it's not just about our risk, risk to us, whatever you do, whatever you speak, that risk is there. But I think the point is that the Indian state wants to shut down this conversation entirely. So the point is that if you even want to hold meetings, say if you want to hold meetings in a series of villages, you can't even announce that you're going to do it, because then it won't happen at all. All you'll get is a shutdown of that. You won't be allowed to. So if you have to hold these meetings, then you're forced to hold them in smaller groups, so that the actual conversation can happen. because otherwise all you'll get is a shutdown, and that they will get to have their say about what you're trying to do, while you won't get to have your say at all. That's the more irritating situation right now, I think. Yeah, but still it'll happen. You're absolutely
right. Okay, so I think I'm going to have to sadly bring this to a close, but it's been really, really very important and I think very inspiring discussion. So I want to thank everyone who's participated, and of course, particularly to thank our speakers, Insha Malik and Kavita Krishnan, for being with us tonight. We, as I mentioned, this our organization, South Asia Solidarity Group, is very much about building solidarity with the kind of struggles which we've been hearing about. And so please do kind of follow us for further events that we're going to be having. For example, on the 18th of May, we have an event coming up about media authoritarianism and censorship, which also speaks to some of the issues which people have raised today. So, you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. So, please do keep in touch with us. And I think Alina, on behalf of the organizers of the summit, also wants to make some closing remarks before we finish.
Precisely. Thank you so much, Kalpana. This has been quite a conversation with a lot of questions by the audience. And as organizers of the EU-India People's Summit, we're incredibly grateful for all of the audience who have been here today and those who have tuned out. So if you want to share this with your friends or colleagues, we're live streaming this, yes, and it will stay on our social media. So you can find all of the recordings either through our YouTube channel, or just if you go on Twitter, hashtag EU-India People's Summit, you will find all the information you need, including the recordings. And similar to Kalpana, I'm going to do a little bit of promo here because the People's Summit is still going on. We have 3 more days. And we're continuing with this same topic, but in French. So on feminism, feminist struggles in India, in French language, so that we can get the word out. And that will happen tomorrow evening. And we're picking up the idea of, Kashmir opening up for foreign investments now through the constitutional changes, and going to talk about those companies who are now coming in and their human rights responsibilities as well in the next couple of days. So if you follow the hashtag, our social media, whatever, you'll find those events and also find them recorded later on. And finally, for the very last closing remark, I hand over to Tumbra, who is my colleague from the organizers team.
Thanks a lot, Alina. Thanks a lot, Kalpana and Insha and Kavita and Amrit also for organizing this panel. And this was really intensive and much needed discussion. Today, I just stepped in to basically do a fundraising exercise because one of our partners, Karwan-e-Mohabbat, have just started raising funds in India through their Keto platform for the COVID second wave, people who are suffering from the COVID second wave. And if you would like to donate, and if you're watching this, then please do consider donating to Karwan-e-Mohabbat, and I'll put the link on our social media, which is Foundation London Stories social media, for how to donate. So thanks a lot once again, everyone, for joining.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.